Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So today we're going to be following up our last video on historical fiction by talking about some tropes in historical fiction. We've done this with a bunch of genres in the past: fantasy, sci-fi, thriller, romance, where we talk about how to write the genre and then break down some tropes in the genre, some that are good, some that are bad, and some that are kind of floating in the middle. Though I did find this video a little tricky, historical fiction isn't as tropey as other genres. There are dozens and dozens of fantasy tropes, like so many. Historical fiction is more based on the time period that it's set in, rather than the elements that the story or characters has. I did consult a friend of mine who is a very experienced historical fiction writer for this video. She gave some really useful insight. So even though one of the positive tropes is going to be a little bit different, I hope that it'll still be helpful. So first, let's start by talking about some tropes to avoid. The first one is relying on bigotry as world building. Now, it's not that bigotry did not exist in the past, because it certainly did. And it's not that it can't have an effect on your story or your characters, because realistically it might. But too many historical fiction writers and even fantasy writers get in the habit of using bigotry to reinforce the time period rather than anything else. You'll see writers who will include a lot of maybe gratuitous violence against marginalized people in their work, and they'll justify it by saying, well, it has to be there because it's the time period. When this same writer might never include any mention of how, sewage was dealt with in a pre-plumbing society. So if you're going to include a ton of bigotry and hate crimes and sexism and racism and, killing off the queer characters, and just because it's realistic for the time period, you should also probably consider all the other pretty unsightly things that existed in the past, because let's be honest, history is full of pretty gross stuff that has nothing to do with hate crimes or marginalized people facing violence. Adding gratuitous scenes of sexual assault or racism or, queer characters dying feels like shock value. It shouldn't just be there because it was realistic. If it's just there for realism, it'll feel gratuitous and it'll feel pretty disrespectful. It should be done with intention and empathy, rather than gratuitously or just to create the time period or because it's realistic. There are a lot of things that are realistic, so for every hate crime you include, maybe you should also think about talking about sewage and how gross that probably was. People used to dump it out the windows, didn't they? Next up is almost the opposite of that, and it's the 21st century protagonist. This is a main character who's basically just taken from the 21st century, plopped into the past. And I don't mean in like a time travel way. I mean, you have a character in the past, born and raised in the past, but somehow this character has all the values and beliefs of modern contemporary society. I think writers fall into this trap because they want their main character to be progressive. They don't want their main character to be problematic. And I get that, but they should be progressive in a way that was progressive at the time. If they're progressive in a way that would be progressive in 2021, it's going to feel very unrealistic, and it's going to feel like the character is just there to kind of shame everyone around them for their backwards, old-timey views. And it's also going to feel like the time period didn't have any effect on this character if their belief system isn't based on it. And again, I'm not saying that your character has to be a bigot because that was realistic. Not at all. Your character, let's say you're writing a book set in 17th century. Your character can be a progressive main character, but you should think about what was progressive in the 17th century and focused on issues that were discussed at the time rather than right now. This is especially common with female main characters. It's very common to have a leading lady who basically feels like she's from 2021, but it also feels like she's just more forward thinking than everyone else, which can feel pretty unrealistic and pretty disrespectful to all these other characters. Write the progressive lead that you want, but write them in a way that is accurate for the time, rather than just bringing a character basically from the 21st century and dropping them into the past. Now, the next trope is not really a trope, it's more a quality of historical fiction, and I think one thing to be careful with is showing your research. Now, a lot of historical fiction requires a ton of research, and you want to be careful about how you show that on the page. You want to show the information, but you don't really want to show that you did research. If the reader is reading it and they feel like they're just being given a lot of facts and a lot of details for you to prove that as the author you did research, it's probably not a great use of that research. But if you're actually integrating the research into the story, then it'll be very, very immersive. The reader won't feel like they're being reminded that you know what you're talking about. They'll feel like they're just reading a story that is an accurate and vivid depiction of the time period. So showing your research isn't necessarily bad, but it depends how you do it. If the reader feels like they're reading your research notes, then it's bad. But if you're showing the research in a way that's immersive and highlights the detail rather than the research, then it's actually great to show your research. You'll see a lot of people say not to show your research in historical fiction, but that might scare some writers away from just including those details. So show the details, but be careful how you do it, so you're not reminding people how much research you did. Now let's talk about a couple tropes to embrace. The first one is filling in the gaps of history. I think it's really fun when historical fiction writers find a gap in history, something that it wasn't recorded, we don't know. And so when a writer finds a really interesting interpretation, a new way to fill in those gaps, maybe a way that makes use of existing information but is very creative and compelling, I think that it can be a great trope. It's really fun. It's a great way to play with the gaps of history and be really creative while still making use of information that we already know. Now the final trope is not really a trope, but it is one to embrace, and it's to take your favorite contemporary trope and put it in a historical setting. Almost any trope can be dropped into historical fiction. Like I said earlier, historical fiction is more about the time period than specific plot elements. If there's a trope you love in contemporary fiction, see what you can do with it in historical fiction. A lot of the times, the fun of historical fiction is taking your favorite topics or your favorite tropes and being able to explore them from a new angle because they're in a new setting and time period. So for example, one of my favorite tropes is fake dating. I just think it's really fun, I think it's really funny, I think it has so much comedic potential. I love fake dating. And so if I wanted to write historical fiction, it might be really fun for me to see what spin I could put on the fake dating trope by putting it in a different historical time period. The best historical fiction trope is whatever trope you love, even if you've never seen it in historical fiction, see what new angle you can find when it's in that new context. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear about your favorite historical fiction tropes in the comments. And remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.